Hi everyone, Tea Drinker here, and today I'm going to be reacting to Black Sails Season 3, Episode 4. The reaction will be a highlight reel of my first time watching the episode, and then the review will be a scene-by-scene analysis upon a rewatch. I have loved doing this so far. I think the first video came out very, very well, and I'm going to be honest, I'm just really excited to get right into this, so that's exactly what I am going to do. Okay, so we're on our mysterious island, I take it. Hello, Mr. Crab. Goodbye, Mr. Crab. Is this our crew? I hope it's our crew. I hope they got water. Oh, thank God they got water. Oh, those poor men. That must be really sore. Poor Sylvie. Is this his new friend? Is this Flint coming over because they're friends now? Is it? Yeah, it's Flint.
You and I haven't exactly been on the warmest of terms lately.
But you will be now because you're friends. There's a tribesman. Is he armed with a gun? Yep, armed with guns. They're back at the fort. I don't think we've seen this character before. Is this just going to be a thing now? How we solve conflict? It's just...
I suggest we manufacture a new exit.
They're going to fly. They're going to build an airplane and fly. That's a gorgeous shot, by the way. That scenery is unbelievable. Can't remember if we've seen this character before. Not to say that we haven't. Just a comment on my general memory. I don't think he's gonna be okay. That view is gorgeous. I'll be your captive. If I get to live in a place like that, that's unbelievable looking. Truly. This is so interesting. Like, there's so much in this show that has to do with law and order, and then having a community that essentially live against that law and order, but have, in and of themselves, created a robust civilization nonetheless. And I've no doubt in my mind that a lot of this was probably based on real events as well, which I really appreciate, especially giving us the perspective of people who have been so dehumanized by slavery and colonialism in general. I get the feeling from this deliberate of a setup that these are not going to be a cruel bunch of people, but there are people who are trying to safeguard themselves as much as possible. Given what they've presumably been through, could you even blame them?
I never liked you.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Jack loves him. Yeah, there you go.
Fuck you, Jack.
There you go. Whoa. Whoa. There we go. Oh, this is interesting how we're getting the outsider perspective of the explosion first.
Items necessary for life here, but impossible to produce.
Yeah.
No evidence of him.
Irish accents for TV and movies.
Supreme.
It's not the worst. I have heard worse.
You underestimated.
For Black Sails, I'll give it the pass.
What about the other one?
What is Vane going to do? Is he looking for Teach? I was thinking Teach would show up. I just wasn't sure in which capacity and whenabouts. The sound design during this whole sequence is really, really great. Good to know that Flint is prioritizing the crewman's state of mind. Oh. Oh.
I miss you too.
Oh. I'm gonna miss this show so much. We're getting his arc a bit quicker than I thought. Oh. Right, so I'm really interested to see what's actually gonna happen when the inevitable fight takes place. That sky is gorgeous, by the way. Oh my god. I just love the production of this show. Beyond words. Truly. What the fuck is gonna happen? Oh, okay. Okay. And they are going to be pressed for time, to say the least. There's just so much action in this season, it's unbelievable. The escape of Charles Vane.
Where are you?
And I'm so sorry.
Earlier, to make order of chaos.
Oh, for God's... This show.
I don't know that I have any more lies left in me.
Whoa. What a line. What a line. Flint having a front row seat to all of this, of everything that's going on in her mind, is crazy.
The pirates, for as long as they draw breath, could and would for a profit compromise that secret.
Yep,
So
that's the dilemma.
they must.
I wasn't sure what direction they were going to go with the reveal. I'm so glad we're getting more of Mr. Scott. Please don't shoot Mr. Scott. Please do not shoot Mr. Scott. Whatever you do, I do not want him to die. I do not want him to die. He's been with us since season 1. Oh, Christ. I will be so upset if he is hurt, seriously. I mean, you know, the episode where we see them talking about getting a pardon from Mr. Scott, Hornigold said that. We saw him smiling. Okay, he's bleeding out. Okay. We'll get you. We'll fix you. You'll be fine. We'll be fine. But I suppose that's the end of his time in Nassau. Oh man! So quick! That was nothing! That was literally 53 minutes my ass. That felt like 20. Alright, so let's talk about 304, scene by scene. Our opening scene, we see Sylvie and Flint starting to get on a little bit well after everything they've been through in the previous episode. And Sylvie gets right into it, saying, you know, if Hornigold had X amount of pardons, as opposed to a universal pardon, and if I were Whitehall, what would I do in this situation? Then what does this say about a possible full-on English retaliation altogether? To which Flint says, well, if something like that were to happen in Nassau, Nassau would basically be leveled already. Nonetheless, both of them decide that it is in the best interest of the crewmen to tell them what is about to occur. I think it's very interesting given where the entire rest of the episode is going to go, with them taken in by another group, by another civilization, that, at least in the immediate future, England truly is the least of their worries. But again, there is then that kind of tragic irony in that they are captured by this community of black escapees, given the fact that with them being white, even if they aren't actually slave traders, they might as well be. And even Flint goes on to say that for how many we saved, we sold many more, so it doesn't make a difference anyway. I'll talk to that a bit more in depth when it comes up, but I think it is very interesting to note how so much of this comes from them being afraid of England due to how they're classified as a group of people, and yet then they end up being taken in by another group of people who are kind of going through the same thing. So for all intents and purposes, our guys are the England of the situation, which I think is a very interesting parallel. And then, of course, right before we get a shot of the islanders holding Billy captive and our crew realizing that they are in grave moral danger, setting up the external conflict for the episode, we get Flint talking about how it needs to be either you or me, or preferably both of us together there in Nassau to help instill it. And I think that's very interesting given how in the previous episodes so much of Jack and Vane's storyline, it ended up being completely disrupted given the fact that Flint is thought to have been dead, that the absence of Flint is what led to their external conflict. So just hearing Flint kind of echo the sentiment that Nassau truly does need him is a nice little detail that I'm glad they added into the episode. After that, we get quite an interesting scene between Elle and Governor, in which the Governor says that he wants her as part of the senior council, given the fact that her expertise and just general competency puts her above 10 of the most expensive men he has, and that the effort for Nassau is going to be something that necessitates a great deal of efficiency. And again, as I said in the previous episode review, it is really interesting to see how Elle is really, she's quite adept. She's quite adept at adapting to her surroundings, but alongside that, she really does like the sense of control that being smart gives her. She likes fitting that role of a leader, or at least leader adjacent role. It is what suits her most comfortably. And, scenes such as that, when you have characters make the case for her intellect, even if there is going to be a subtext of manipulation, regardless of that, it is something that backs it up for the character. So in the previous couple of episodes, we have had Elle's character reinforced. Her arc has been more of that of reinforcement rather than change. And I think it suits the character very, very well. It kind of feels like we're getting to know Elle a little bit more, even though we're not actually learning anything new, which I really enjoy seeing. We had the scene after that in which Vane, Jack, Max, and Featherstone found themselves within the fort. The locals are none too pleased to see that. They definitely want Vane's head, as they make it quite explicit. So this is very much just a setup for the plot point for the rest of the characters at this point. There isn't a huge amount to comment on, save for Jack casually opening the door, shooting a man, and then responding, yeah, he's Paul, or something like that. I do very much enjoy the dark humor that's within a show such as this. And I think, again, it's a very good level of intrigue for the audience, for Jack to say, okay, we can't use the tunnels, but there might be another way, and then the scene ends on that bit of a cliffhanger for us to then ponder what it is that could possibly happen. So, not much to say other than that. Following this, we get quite an elongated sequence for the show. It's rare that we see one particular story beat drawn out over 2 or 3 scenes tied together. We see our men who are being captured by the Islanders, who we understand explicitly are former slaves. Our men are captured. Sylvia's very quickly questioned by the leader of the Islanders. We can, for the sake of argument, call her the Queen of the island, just to make things easier. He's questioned by the Queen, who asks him the very valid question, was that, if you were me, would you trust a gang of pirates? And following the men's imprisonment on the island and the crewmen being taken away one by one, we were introduced to the character of Ben Gunn, who is supposedly an Irish character, and as I mentioned in my reaction, regardless of whether or not I keep it in part of the reaction, I will say is that his Irish accent, it's not bad. From what I understand through IMDb, the actor is South African. I have certainly heard worse Irish accents, and you know what? I love Black Sails so much that even if it was a little bit worse, I'd let it slide. In any case, we get some really great dialogue from him, saying that he was the last of 13 crewmen on a slave trader ship, and from that woman he learned 12 hard lessons, that any men who lay eyes on this place are to see death, and she will do everything in her power to make sure that you fear it in the interim. And being told that all of these detainees are going to be forced into forced labor, the likes of which they had never been seen before, as a form of, I don't know what would be an appropriate word, perhaps even reparation, or some sort of divine justice for what would have happened to them, of course, as former slaves themselves. So it's, I think a storyline like this is really, really interesting to have it paralleled against everything that we know, because again, at this point, it's really, really been hammered home, the idea of England being seen as the so-called bastion of law and order in the world. This is the world for them. In the literal sense of the entire earth, England is the ruler. England is the head of state for the planet. And we've, at this point, gotten very interesting, very thorough examinations as to how deeply flawed of a structure and hierarchy that is, and then how the structure and hierarchy of piracy comes into that. So to now be introduced to a third civilization and a third community, that of former slaves, those who are very much able to draw a very clear line in the sand as to whether or not people can and cannot be trusted on a fundamental level, and that line in the sand being determined by one's race, is incredibly interesting, because it isn't something that you can just put on and put off. It isn't something that you can sort of cosplay or work your way through in a way that somebody like Flint may have done. We've already seen in the series thus far how, for as much progress as someone like Mr. Scott can make, and arguably even Max can make, they are still always going to be tied to the chain of their skin color. So to have now a group of predominantly, if not entirely, white, or at the very least non-black men, being held at the whim of an entirely all-black civilization, has created for us, the audience, a very strong story. It's created a very strong story, and again, it's created a very strong reinforcement of the themes of how all these structures will inevitably end in corruption, how all these structures are always going to have the people within it view themselves as being a victim of the world and trying to rid themselves of the evils that plague the world, and most importantly, as being the ones who are in the position of power to do so. Whether you're Whitehall, whether you're Vane, or whether we're the girl who we've just been introduced to in this episode, and arguably even Eleanor as well, the show is really doing a fantastic job of establishing the compare and contrast of all these civilizations. Following this, back at the fort, we got a great scene between Jack and Vane bidding their farewells to one another. I really enjoyed the scene, as I'm sure many people did, in the sense that they were able to do justice to both of the characters' interaction without diving into overly sentimental dialogue or anything like that. Even Jack, saying along the lines of, I never liked you, which of course we know is complete BS. Aside from that, I think it is very interesting, given the fact that in the previous episode in 303, we had Anna make that comment about how Jack truly does cling to how many a man have clinged themselves to the likes of Charles Vane, if not Charles Vane directly himself, as a means to an end of making themselves a proper pirate, whereas it's only Jack who seems to have been the one to build a career out of it. And here we have Jack very directly saying that were I to go with you and teach, I would be doing nothing more than making a ward out of myself. That's speaking not even of the danger he would put himself in were Vane to cross Jack, or were Vane to be out of the picture, and how Jack would fend for himself. Even without that element of it, in general, Jack seems to be done climbing ladders. And with the money that he and Anna has, it's not that they aren't going to be struggling, but Jack doesn't seem to value having to prove himself against a hierarchy anymore, which I think is very, very interesting. Of course, with seeing how the rest of the season, and indeed the series itself, ends up, I am curious to see what way his character is going to continue to progress and change. But nonetheless, to see him at this particular juncture and how far he has come has been truly satisfying as an audience member. I loved seeing the goodbye between him and Vane, the callback to the "fuck you Jack" line that has been spoken so many a time at this point, and you really do get the sense that Vane has a deep level of respect for Jack, which, I don't know, I mean, I know this is a little reductive, but a lot of their relationship seems to be like a bit of an odd couple, a bit of an unlikely duo. It's like the jock and the geek have teamed up, and how both of them have a mutual respect for the other's strength. Although, of course, it's so interesting given the fact that Jack, we've seen, is more than capable of defending himself physically, just not as strong as the others. And Vane's intellect totally goes without saying. Really great scene. Really, really great scene. So, right before the explosion of the fort, we get this short scene between Elle and Governor, which I think is worth noting. We get two things from it. The first being Elle very directly saying that I understand Charles Vane is just one element to this entire procedure, which is so interesting given the fact that later on in the episode we have Vane directly asked by Teach, how do you feel about Eleanor as part of the entire plan? Which is so to see Elle talk about Vane to the Governor, and then Vane talk about Elle to Teach, and where both of them stand with regards to how they view one another and the potential death of the other. I think another great parallel. The other thing I liked about that scene is that it does make it clear how, particularly at this point, whether or not it's applicable to previous seasons is another thing, but Elle is very much she's very much aware of the social dynamic in which, were she to be seen arriving on the island with Governor Rogers, what exactly that would do, and in particular how she is willing to kind of take more of a backseat position. That's why she holds so much apprehension towards being an advisor. She is happy to take more of a backseat approach if it means that Rogers' plan is successful. So I'm kind of predicting that in future episodes, because of that, her willingness to thwart Rogers will come at a very real possibility of creating a greater risk to her as a person, and she has to decide between the lesser of two evils, or rather, what seems to be the least scariest path to go down. And given the fact that that is off the heels of her going through a similar thing between siding with Flint and siding with Vane in the previous season, I think is another great fork in the road for Elle's character. Following Hornigold and Dufresne seeing the explosion at the fort occur, we go back to the island where we see Billy contemplate if there is a third option for the men escaping from the situation, one which it would involve talking to the daughter of the Queen. We get a bit of exposition that the Queen is omnipotent ruler of the island, and that her husband is existent as a king but is not here for the time being. A detail which I actually missed the first time around. I think I was still getting used to seeing all the set design and what was going on, that I didn't pick up on every little bit of dialogue there. So again, that is reinforcing what I was saying earlier, in that every single civilization is going to have this internal conflict. It's going to have the dispute over what counts as good and bad, right and wrong. And you have Sylvie saying there very explicitly how surely it cannot be the case that every single person here is of one mind. So Sylvie is already starting to pick up on the patterns, that if he were to try to reach the daughter on some sort of mutual understanding, that he could appease to her in a way that he simply cannot appease to the Queen, who is, for valid reasons, dead set on not letting anyone who looks like them have any sort of mercy. I think it works for reinforcing Sylvie's character as being the talker, Sylvie's role as being the negotiator in this type of social dynamic, and indeed just how he is as a person entirely. And again, it is reinforcing those themes of how every single civilization is going to have such a high degree of internal conflict. Following this, we get a short action sequence in which we see Vane accosted by the crewmen who are looking for his head, to which he is promptly saved by Teach, who has made it clear that he's not going anywhere with regards to his loyalty for Vane. I think it was, just from a production point of view, because that's really all I want to talk about there, just really well done. I like the fact that it wasn't just for the actual editing, where it wasn't too fast, wasn't too slow. It seemed like the appropriate pace for that sort of action sequence that is very physical. It's very physical, but it's still a sword fight, so it's not going to require like something like, let's say, a lot of choking or anything like that. It's something that would necessitate that sort of rapid editing, but at the same time, the actual camera work, it had shaky cam, but it also did some really cool, really effective shots of actually pushing the camera in at times, particularly when a sword goes into another man's body, which I really appreciate. And again, looking at scenes like that where so much of it does depend on the physicality of the actors, stuff like the set design, costume design, and of course the cinematography and sound design really work effectively, but in particular the choreography as well. It felt very believable. It didn't feel like there was anything too over the top. It never feels over the top, the action in this show, which I do really appreciate. So our next scene, in which we see Mr. Scott, as I said in all the way back when I was doing the write-ups for this show, that I really enjoy Mr. Scott as a character. I think having that sort of having a presence such as he, where it's a former slave to a man holding quite a reputable position of power within Nassau, is a great addition to the show, in that it really serves as a representation and a bit of a microcosm for the state of, well, I suppose humanity, for lack of a better term, in this type of show, how so much of the socio-political state of the black citizens of Nassau can be encapsulated within someone like Mr. Scott. It's interesting to see Hornigold getting Dufresne to send back a report that they were able to breach the fort, but they weren't able to find any of the gold amidst the completely unpredictable explosion, and how Mr. Scott is telling Hornigold that he would be happy to bring the slaves back, and that he would be able to argue out of their best interest. Again, it's something that I wasn't fully clicking with the first time around. I wasn't quite sure what was happening there. Of course, the ending sequence of the episode does make it very clear, but I think looking back at it, just this scene in and of itself, I think it is very, very interesting in that we would be totally valid to believe that Mr. Scott is working within a set of parameters that he himself would be able to rationalize and view as genuinely ethical, despite who he is and how he looks and how we have literally seen him in chains all the way in season 1, that he would be able to rationalize it if he views it for the benefit of Nassau and indeed for law and order. So I think at this particular juncture, and some people may disagree with me on it, but I think that it is very much open to interpretation whether or not his character would indeed be on the side of the slaves or on the side of Hordigold, which I think as a character study is very, very interesting. And there we have it. In the next scene, we see Vane explicitly seeing El as the adversary, and the reason why there is such a high bounty on his head. El back at it again. And I think I made a joke about it in the reaction, but like just the idea that Vane would even consider taking her back again. If the show were to do it, I wouldn't go as far as to say I'd be disappointed, but if they were to have some shape or form of Vane relinquishing his grudge on El for any reason, it would have to be a damn good reason at this point, because he has every reason to just not want anything to do with her and to actively do what he can to thwart her to the best of his ability. Very interesting scene there in which Billy details how the slaver crewmen, of which there's only one alive, Ben Gunn, how what happened to them, 6 of them were murdered, 4 of them the remainder of them tried to escape, 4 of which were immediately killed, one who was killed after a couple of hours, and then God himself, who was the only one to survive out of all whom tried to escape, and he just ran into a dead end, and how for Billy this gives him enough intellectual leeway for him to think maybe there is a plan, maybe we can learn from the mistakes and try our own way out, to which Flint very sardonically says is that it is a plan and it keeps his mind off of things. And what I liked about that is that, again, this is the second time now in succession which Sylvie is saying that what's the point of having a plan like this if the people involved died? Because that's exactly what he said to Billy, with regards to Billy saying to him, you need to find a way to emulate the likes of Miranda and Gates. And given Flint's mental state in the last episode, particularly with the hallucinations, and of course we're about to get into another daydream right now, it's quite interesting to see him have that moment of clarity and that moment of self-reflection to say that, if this is something that puts a man's mind at ease, who am I to take that away? Likewise, then, the daydream scene we see with him speaking to Miranda, and which is so interesting, talking about her as being Miranda when it isn't just his subconscious, if not to a large degree his conscious mind, in the sense that in that daydream, Flint makes it very clear in saying that he wishes that there were a way for him to just stay rather than to move on into the remainder of his life that does not involve her, to which both of them silently acknowledge that that is just not what's going to happen, that eventually he will have to find a way to deal with this. We've gotten so much with Flint in the last 3 episodes. It's truly, truly incredible. And even though the external conflict pacing is quite a bit slower this time around, arguably slower. I mean, of course, there is tons happening, but the setup is definitely starting us off slow so that it can all come together at the season's end. Nonetheless, the internal conflict for Flint is just insane. I cannot believe we're getting this much content this quickly. It's truly remarkable. And of course, directly after the scene of Flint talking to Miranda about having to leave things behind, we get Jack and Anne having the exact same conversation, just for completely different reasons, of course. And I do very much appreciate how in the previous 3 episodes they made it so explicit how Jack's inciting incident for the season, how his plot point is going to be his legacy has been threatened. And this is very much setting up the Act 2 for his seasonal arc, in that how is he going to adapt to a new world in which his legacy has been left behind and all he has is his wits, his money, and his Anne, and he has to do his best to hold on to all 3 of those for God knows how long he could even do that. And then you have Anne, who in a way seems to be in a place, far more in a place of peace that Jack is, despite the fact that she has, at this point, left Max behind, presumably for good. I mean, obviously, I think most of us would agree that we are going to get at least one more scene between the two of them in the succeeding 16 episodes. Nonetheless, I think that a scene like that between Jack and Anne is really great in that it's making it marks a clear transitionary period for both of them. So the following scene, in which Sylvie is talking to the Queen's daughter, I think even without seeing the rest of the episode, or indeed the season itself, most people would be able to put two and two together, that they have created a really interesting potential setup, at the very least, a potential setup for Sylvie's crew and the island inhabitants to team up together and to put their resources together in order to face England to whatever capacity it could. I mean, it is such a good point that Sylvie brings up, these men. They're ultimately, what it comes down to is, alongside protecting themselves, it comes down to an anger at England, and to which the woman just as, in just as many words, says, is like, yeah, anger towards England. Yeah, well, you're white. You don't need to tell me about being angry towards England, for God's sake. And it says that despite all that, despite our anger, how many amongst us would give up the right to achieve a life of freedom? And of course, we saw that in the previous episode with the crewmen on the beach, who are happily able to succumb to Hornigold in order to have freedom from Nassau, freedom from piracy, despite how many of them may be doing it specifically for the 10,000 for Vane's head. A great concept is introduced there, the idea of it. Well, it's not really introduced, it's more so a reinforcement. It's just reintroduced from a different angle, from a different perspective. But it's the same concept that has been there pretty much from the beginning of the entire series, in which you are a slave to the concept of freedom. You are a slave to the possibility of freedom, that the anger that you view as being the necessary driving force for you to achieve a semblance of peace. Well, again, as is something that I mentioned before, the eternal paradox of fighting for peace, and what that is going to do to you, as well as the people you love, as well as just civilization as it stands. So for Sylvie to then be very, very direct and say that, whereas your mother wants you to ultimately fear England, we want England to be feared by us, and whether or not that was taken as an insult, or instead she's heard all she needs to hear, even if it was stuff she didn't want to hear. In this particular scene, it's unclear, but it is clear. What is clear about the situation is that has struck a chord with her, regardless of whether or not she is going to approach it in the way maybe someone like Lord Ashe approached an uncomfortable truth, or whether or not she is going to approach it in the way Sylvie has approached uncomfortable truths. But in any case, I thought that the dialogue back and forth was fantastic. Like, it wasn't too much, wasn't too little. It was exactly what was necessary to get the character conflict across, as well as a reinforcement of the overarching themes, and of course the seasonal plot as well. I was really, really impressed by. So the scene in which Teach is talking to Vane about how he feels about his anger towards Elle, which is something that I referenced earlier in discussing Elle's conversation with the governor. I thought it was, a very insightful bit of dialogue into Vane's psyche there. The fact that, as Teach himself says, that he's willing to look past his anger in order to do the right thing and to to make the most practical choice that he can in the situation, and to be willing to, not be petulant, if not just completely hell-bent on revenge in that moment. And for Vane to end that scene in saying that she taught me a lesson once, and whether or not that was a direct lesson, an indirect lesson, whether that was through something Elle explicitly said or done, or was something that came upon reflection, particularly maybe in a hallucination of her that we seen all the way back in season 1, is a very interesting concept. It's a very interesting concept in that it's left ambiguous, and that it's for us as the audience to infer what he meant, if indeed he actually had one concrete meaning to begin with. Really great stuff. So we have the scene in which Elle and the governor are speaking within the ship itself, and the scene is being overheard by a woman we saw work for the governor back in 302, I believe, at the very beginning of that. She had a little bit of a back and forth with Elle, which made it clear the way that she does view Elle as lower and higher at the same time. That bit of a paradox. It's interesting, Elle talking about her not even self-consciousness, just genuine apprehension of both her and Governor Rogers, both of them traveling to Nassau, respectively, given the reputation that Elle has and her so-called untrustworthiness. And to have the woman listen into the whole conversation, I'm not entirely sure if that's going to, well, I'm assuming it's going to set up some sort of, not a betrayal, but definitely a thorn in the side of Elle down the line, of how Elle's untrustworthiness is going to spread throughout the men on this ship. Not that they necessarily need that much convincing, but nonetheless, it is something that is going to actively work against Elle. So it's interesting to have that, I suppose maybe you could call it an act of God, or maybe just bad luck in that situation, that her moment of vulnerability with Rogers is being overheard entirely. And again, it does a good job of illustrating how Elle's self-consciousness and her best efforts to navigate the societal dynamic of Nassau is still very much going to be at play, even when she's on the side that is now basically against Nassau, even when she's on the side where she is somewhat protected, I guess, insofar as you could be protected in this kind of a way, and nonetheless, she is very much at the whim of the people of Nassau. The scene in which we see Vane's crew use the fire ship as a deterrent to the English forces, as a means to an end of them it gives them a slipstream in order to circumvent any future attacks for the time being anyway. There isn't a huge amount to say in terms of, character analysis or anything like that necessarily. So what I will say is that from a production point of view, that looked absolutely fantastic. I'm not entirely sure how much of that was aided by CGI, but for the stuff that looked like it was all practical effects, I just absolutely loved seeing it. And the amazing scenes with Flint in this season, and indeed the series itself, just don't stop coming. So right off the heels of Sylvie talking to the Queen's daughter, who questions him as to why she believes the men, or why Sylvie believes the men to have not accepted the pardon, and he talks about the anger at England and wanting England to fear them, and her making the inarguable point of how for men who were enslaved by a system to not want to get their freedom by any means necessary, even if it means giving up their anger, is death itself. And then for Flint to very directly say, I was the one who brought in these laws to begin with, or helped bring them in, and maybe accepting the pardons and living the rest of my life that way isn't the victory I always saw was. I mean, again, we had that in season 1 of him talking about how wanting to walk so far that to hold an oar, people would just see it as a shovel. And Sylvie very plainly saying is like, this is not inevitable, we have a way to survive this. And Flint tying all this back to everything that he has seen and done. And for him to so explicitly talk about how so much of this comes down to the lies we tell ourselves. That Billy's is the idea that he could fight his way out, Sylvie's is that he can talk his way out, and how Flint is truly at this crossroads where for him to do anything other than to sit and let all this fall upon him would then be throwing himself into another lie, and for him to use phrases such as making order out of chaos, and him even explicitly using the word forgive, for him to talk about the concept of forgiveness on the heels of what we've seen happening to Miranda, like again, literally in 303, where he sees her saying to him, forgive me. On top of all this, Sylvie is totally right to ask Flint at that moment, where are you? So then we get the scene of the Queen speaking to her daughter, who we now know her name is Maddie. So the scene does a good job of reinforcement as well as bringing in new exposition as a setup for the following episode, which I suppose I'll just talk to right away, the idea that the king they referred to earlier is none other than our friend, Mr. Scott. So being able to see Mr. Scott for over 2 seasons now, and now seeing him tie into this brand new civilization, and again how that works with all the overarching themes, and indeed just the plot itself of law and order and structures of power, of slave and slave master, it was a great inclusion. It was a great way of connecting those threads together, truly. And of course, then from an expository point of view, the setup for the succeeding episode rather, is going to be that the Queen is very much take no prisoners in that way, unless of course they're laborers. But she does not seek any sort of mercy for these men if it's going to come at the risk of her and the thousands of people on that island being in chains again. So that coming up against Sylvie's conviction that he can work his way out of this and that he has gotten under Maddie's skin, and of course Flint very much beginning to relent against the idea of conflict altogether, is such a fantastic setup for the next episode, which at this point I have not seen and I'm very, very much looking forward to. As for how Mr. Scott is going to end up involved in all this, well, that's another thing altogether. And finally, we have the reveal of Mr. Scott walking onto the beach, which tells us that he is the king that the Queen has been referring to. And yeah, again, it's great. I referenced earlier how when he was speaking to Hornigold, we weren't really sure as to whether or not he was going to be on the side of the slaves or he was going to go with Hornigold. So seeing that he's not only on the side of the slaves, but is actively part of the community in which they could actually seek help is great catharsis. It's great catharsis, and again, as aforementioned in discussing the previous scene, it's a great way of tying those threads together. From an expository point of view as well, when there was the interaction there with the Redcoats, and we saw one of the Redcoats who's still alive kind of like clinging for his gun or just to get up in general, which is great because then it kind of informs us that there is going to be word brought back to Hornigold of Mr. Scott's actions. And of course Mr. Scott is going to survive. They wouldn't show him alive at the end of the episode for him to just succumb to his injuries on a rowboat. That being said, when he does eventually make it to the island, and we know that there's going to be this ongoing dispute between our boys and the inhabitants of the island, and then for Mr. Scott to be brought into the fray kind of like as a third party amidst all of that particular chaos, I think is going to be really, really interesting to see. And I think that's pretty much where I'm going to leave it. I'm going to say, in comparison to the other episodes I've seen, well, at least of this season so far, my initial reaction, whilst I did really enjoy the episode, there was a lot of the overarching themes and interconnected storylines that I didn't really appreciate until it came to this second watch. In particular with, again, that conversation between Sylvie and Maddie, and again, the conversation with Flint. I did really like the conversation with Flint the first time around, but again, seeing it within the full context of Maddie talking about if you are truly seeking freedom from the country who you hate, why are you giving into anger rather than giving into peace? And then to see Flint echo that sentiment was really, really compelling stuff. As with this series in general, I'm loving it, but this season in particular, I'm just engaged in every single episode. And look, season 2 was amazing in its own right, and in a way I don't think season 2 can be touched. I think that each season does truly seem to be telling its own particular book. Each season is its own particular book in this overarching series. It's doing its own thing beginning to end. So I don't think it would be fair necessarily to compare everything to season 2 for as much as I loved it. This is very much doing a fantastic job. Only 4 episodes in, again, what they've done with Flint so far, so quickly, so deeply, is truly incredible. I cannot commend the writers enough for how much they've given me thus far, and we're not even at the halfway point of the season. So I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for watching, and if you have made it all the way to the end of the video, then I reward you with an interesting fact. Did you know that the term boycott is named after a real-life person of the name Charles Boycott? So, back in Ireland in 1880, there was intense agrarian conflict between an English land agent by name of Charles Boycott, who met with conflict with his tenants as they were struggling to pay his rent amidst him actually raising the price of the rent itself. When he refused to lower the price of the rent amidst extreme poverty at this time during the Land War, they decided to organize a mass economic ostracization of Boycott himself. Essentially, the people refused to do anything with the man. They refused to work with him, they refused to sell goods with him, they basically made him the pariah of their community. And given the fact that this level of complete social ostracization that was so specific to the economics and well-being of the community hadn't really been done before, it hadn't really been described in such of a way, it became known as boycotting. They used his own name against him when referring to it for years to come, and since 1880, literally within the same year, the term has become part of the English lexicon ever since. So, there you go. I think that's a fact very fitting with a lot of the themes from today's show. So, that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.